We believe we have a mandate to bring godly change to our nation and the world through the 7 spheres or mountains of influence. Welcome to the Truth and Liberty broadcast, brought to you by Andrew Wommack Ministries.
Welcome to our Monday night Truth and Liberty broadcast. I tell you, we are going to have a great time tonight. You know, this is where we talk about current events. We talk about politics. We talk about social things. We do a lot of things that we don't typically deal with in just a Christian setting. And it's really been good. We've had on a lot of congressmen and lawyers. We've had on the President Trump's personal lawyer. And it's just amazing. The things that we're learning. I hope that you're enjoying this. And tonight we've got William Federer with us, and I tell you, this man has been a blessing to me. You came probably the first time we met, it's about been 2 years ago or 3. Do you remember?
I know I've been here.
I'll say 3.
Going on 3 dozen times.
And I've been getting his American Minute sent to me every day. And that is one of the few things that I read every day. There's some things that, you know, I just don't have time and I'll delete them. But man, I have read every one of them. I keep them, save them, and I have learned a lot. Bill, you are educating. You're teaching this old dog new tricks. It's been awesome.
Well, one of my favorite quotes is from Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian on John F. Kennedy's staff. And the quote is, "History is to the nation what memory is to the individual." Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so have you ever met an individual who's lost their memory? Mm-hmm. It's sort of sad. They have Alzheimer's. They forgot who they are. Anybody can take stuff away from them. Well, we have national Alzheimer's.
That's true.
Here we are, the freest country the planet has ever seen, and with more individual opportunity. And we forgot who we are. We forgot our identity, and we're letting our freedoms be taken.
All right, I'm going to have to break in because this guy is just like you touch him and out comes all of this stuff. So we need to give you a few things before we get started here.
Yes.
This is Richard Harris. He's our resident lawyer. He's our chief counsel, I think, is the official title. He also runs our practical government school. And we've got some giveaways. We've got some people to announce that won last week and how you can participate by sending in questions. So,
absolutely.
Richard?
Well, thank you, Andrew. First, let me just begin by sharing a little bit of information about some things that are coming up here at the ministry. Next week, April 25th, John Tesh is going to be here in concert. And John Tesh has an incredible healing testimony. He was healed listening to Andrew's teachings, and it's a phenomenal testimony. April 25th. The Kingdom Business Summit is June 12th through 14th here in Woodland Park, and then the Summer Family Bible Conference, July 1st through the 5th, covers the 4th of July. It's an awesome event.
You know, and let me just mention that John Tesh has done, I think, 6 or 7 PBS specials, and so PBS is coming here, and they're going to film his concert, and he told them, he says, I want to talk about my healing, and so they're going to do a separate broadcast with me and Barry Bennett and John Tesh, talking about his healing, answering questions live from people, and that's going to be aired on PBS.
Public television spreading the gospel.
This is going to be awesome.
I love it, yeah. Well, folks, we do have every week we give away a free product, and this week it's a book. I was going to say it's by Bill Federer, but I think more accurately it's by Susie Federer. What'd you do? Write the foreword in it? But if you want to be eligible to receive this, then you need to register on our website. And each week we select somebody to win that product. Last week's winner was Erwin Weatherly, who won George Washington's Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior. So register on our website, and you are eligible to receive that. And then if you need prayer, if you'd like to call in for prayer, we welcome you to do that. The number for that is 719-635-1111. And then the last thing I'd like to point out is that the Truth and Liberty Coalition is listener support or viewer supported, and we thank you so much for your generosity and donations. And you can go on our website and use the donate function there, or text GIVE to 719-301-2552.
And by way of introduction of Bill, if you don't know him, I've got 3 pages of biography here, and I'm not going to take time to read all of this, but he's got all of these books that he's done. He's got some that have sold over 500,000 copies, one book. His books have been quoted in Supreme Court decisions, and just as recently as, say, a year ago when Kentucky passed some of their laws, they cited some of the historical facts that Bill has put out. Bill has been on everybody's program who's important, and we could spend a lot of time mentioning all of that. And anyway, God is using him in a supernatural way. This isn't the first time we've had him on our program. Last time we spent quite a bit of time talking about how in the world do you learn this much about history, and he gave us that. We won't go into that tonight. But I tell you, this man has been a real blessing to me. And as he was saying at the top of the program, we've got national Alzheimer's. And because of it, I mean, the things that are being put forth today by some of the progressive openly advocating socialism, they don't have a clue what has happened in the past, or they could not even be promoting these things.
That's right.
You know, socialism is nothing more than dictatorship. And when you look at it, Hitler was the head of the National Socialist Workers' Party. That's what Nazi stands for, National Arbeiter, which means worker, Socialistica. Stalin was the head of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He was a dictator. And so when you look at it, it's a hierarchical structure. It's a pyramid structure. So you have the dictator at the top. The Communist Party members are the new royalty.
Yeah.
They get the nice houses, and then the people are the peasants, the subjects. Their fate's determined by the state. I talk in schools, and I ask the students, in a socialist country, who decides who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house? Somebody in the government dictates those things. Well, whoever ultimately dictates those things is the dictator. Now, Lenin said that socialism was a transition phase between capitalism and communism. So you got capitalism empowers the individual. I point out there's two kinds of capitalism. There's this globalist, George Soros, West bad, that wants a one world government. But the individual capitalism, where you get to earn a living and make stuff and sell it, that empowers the individual. So capitalism empowers the individual. Socialism is this transition phase to take it all away until finally the government owns it all and you own nothing.
So if people understood it, they wouldn't embrace socialism. But what is the attraction to socialism? How is it that these people are embracing it? What is it that's attractive?
Well, it is a sales job. There's something called deconstruction, and it's a sales technique. So you separate people from their past, get them into a neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I would do is say negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. You're still using that old stuff? Don't you know it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? You're like, ooh, really? You're repulsed by it. Now I have you into a neutral. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpastes out there? Then I give you my pitch for this tartar-controlled breast freshener stuff. So what they do is they go into the classrooms and they say negative things about the Founding Fathers. They took land from India and sold people into slavery, chauvinists, and the students are, ooh, really? And they're repulsed by it. Now you got the kids into a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them your pitch for LGBT or socialism or Islam. Europe went through this. Europe went from a Judeo-Christian Europe with Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods. Then it went into a secular Europe with the French Revolution and Robespierre and Napoleon spreading it all around, this free sex, anything goes. Now it's turning into an Islamic Europe, with Mohammed being the #1 name for newborns in London, Milan, and Paris, no-go zones, and a rash of vandalism on these cathedrals that are taking place.
Right. I've got a different method for selling toothpaste and toothbrush, and that is that you give free chips and dip. So people come up and they take a chip and dip it in there and, it tastes like manure. And you say, you want to buy a toothbrush? You create a need. Anyway, I was way off the subject. But, they come along, and I've heard a lot of people talk about health care. And they'll say, but these people don't have health care. And they create this need, and they present that socialism is the answer. And yet you probably know a lot more about this than I do. But I've viewed, the Canadian and the English healthcare system that people talk about how great it is. But why is it that all of the Canadians send the ones that can afford it, send them to the United States to get it done? And I just read in the last week or two that they're basically saying that the English healthcare system is about to collapse.
Yeah, I think
in bad
Sweden
shape.
too. 5 different things that God gives commands to: individuals, families, employees, churches, and government. God commands individuals to be caring and generous and give to the poor. There's no command for the family to be generous. The commands to the family are: husbands, love your wives; children, submit to your parents. the employers, their commands are don't withhold wages and employees give an honest day's work. And the church is commanded to take care of the poor, orphans and widows. And through history, churches have started the hospitals and the medical clinics and the digging wells in the villages. And they did all of the social programs. They had the schools. The government is not commanded to take care of the poor. The government's command is the simplest. Protect the innocent, punish the guilty. What's happened is the church has neglected doing different responsibilities, and the government has usurped them. And so you get Christians saying, well, we're supposed to take care of the poor, government do it. It's like, no. When the early church these people sold their land, and they brought the money to the feet of who? The apostles. They didn't bring their money to the feet of Pilate. Say, here, Pilate, you're the government. Here's a little more money for the Roman Empire to spread around. No, if you want to give money, you give it to the church. The church has this moral obligation. Now, why is this necessary? Church wants to help people out of the poor situation. Historically, two reasons. One, when they got out of the poor, they were thankful and they would contribute back. The Bible talks all about charity, nothing about taking away. And secondly, whenever the government is involved in distributing anything, the government programs are run by people who want to keep their jobs.
Absolutely.
And so when you have a whole lot of people working for the government wanting to keep their jobs, it turns into this bureaucratic blob that has this motivation to increase itself and take money from those who are threatening their job and funneling it to those who are supporters. So you tax your political opponents and you give money to entitlements to your political supporters. Anytime human beings, a guy got a Nobel Prize for figuring that out. His name was James Buchanan, not Pat Buchanan, but James Buchanan. In 1980, Nobel Prize, economist. He noticed the biggest thing on the federal budget is debt. He goes, what goes into the decision-making? Why is the government increase? He finds out the congressmen vote for it. And he goes, why do they vote for it? He finds out that when they're facing a re-election, they'll vote to go in debt, to spend money in their districts to help win votes.
That's right.
But they won't vote for the necessary tax increase to pay for it all. And so each Congress passes it on to the next, and it grows into this big blob. But that's the problem. People want to keep their jobs, and when you get the government distributing any type of program, it's going to have the main motivation is to benefit the people that are doing the distributing, not the people at the
bottom.
bottom.
Not only that, but it's always going to be inefficient. Government is never as efficient as the private sector doing it.
When it comes to handouts, the Bible says, if a man will not work, neither let him eat. And the government is not capable of that one-on-one level of discipleship the church is called to do, where you can hold individuals accountable, and that kind of ministry that takes place at the church level, the local church level, and the government just hands out money. It just encourages laziness.
Interesting, ancient Israel, they came up with a way to take care of the poor by letting everyone who harvests their field leave the gleanings, the corners for the poor people to pick through. So every local farmer was responsible to take care of the local poor. It was done on a cellular level. In Egypt, when they had a famine, the government had all the grain, and the government gave it back in exchange for their lives. You want it?
Slavery.
So when you have the government distributing stuff, it's always going to be exchanged for your freedoms. But when you do it on a cellular level, where every person takes care of their neighbor, that's the biblical model.
Wow.
I was visiting with a group of pastors 30 years ago, and there was about 10 of us sitting around the table, and we were discussing Christian education, and should children go to public school or Christian school or homeschool or stuff like that. And this one guy didn't say anything for about 30 minutes. And finally I said, you hadn't said a thing. What do you think? And he says, I think you're discussing the wrong thing. He says, should there even be public school?
Right.
And then he went back, as you did, and said, God gave that command to the family. Schools were started by the churches, and they used it to educate. And when they started seeing how successful education was in changing these people's lives, then the government came in and took it over, and that's where all of our problems come from.
You think of it, we're spirit, mind, and body. Your mind is like a super fancy computer. It's more than that, but it's at least that. And your body's like the computer case, which makes it silly for people to argue over what color the computer case is. Reds are better than greens. It's like, it doesn't matter what color the case is, it's what software is running on it. And so the battle is who gets to load the software on the next generation's brains. The other side wants to put malware and spyware and corrupted files on there, and we want to put God. The Bible is, in a sense, a behavioral software program. right? Love your enemies, be nice. It's also the pathway to heaven, right? But it teaches you how to. So the question is, who gets to load the software on the next generation's brains? When Plato, 380 BC, his book Republic, he says when a tyrant will take control of a city, he'll take the children away from the parents before they've been affected by the habits of their parents, and he'll bring them into the city and indoctrinate them with noble lies. He calls them noble lies, but the lies help them stay in power. Yeah. And so the idea of taking kids away from their parents and the government indoctrinating them with all kinds of lies keeps those people that are in power.
Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, all of those guys followed that same mode.
Yeah.
Grabbing those kids.
Wow.
So we need to talk about some of the local things. Real quickly, you were sharing with us a little bit about the history of Notre Dame. That has been on fire today. What's happened?
Right. So within the last several months, there's been an increase in attacks on cathedrals and churches across Europe. Vandalism. Just a short time ago, they arrested a number of Muslim ladies in front of Notre Dame with a car full of cans full of gasoline. And so Notre Dame has been the icon of spiritual Christian Europe. It was begun in 1163 AD, completed in 345 AD. So, I mean, it took 2 centuries to build.
Now, it couldn't be completed in 345.
1345.
1345, gotcha.
See, that's why I need you to keep me straight here. So
well, I don't know much. I don't know the history, but I can count.
No, 1345. So yes, it took almost 2 centuries to build. It was there with St. Louis, right? Louis the Ninth, the King of France, and he left on the 7th and 8th Crusades. It survived the French Revolution. It survived the bubonic plague in the 1300s. It survived the French Revolution, the Robespierre, Napoleon was crowned there. And it survived World War I, World War II, and then just today, it's burnt. Wow. And there's an indication that may have been intentional, arson, but nevertheless, it is definitely the most spiritual icon for France and to a large extent Western Europe. And so this is significant. This is the most relatable Christian place in Western Europe up in flames today. And
if it was arson, well, then it's an attack on our ideology. I mean, it's on the culture.
Well, you know, we've also seen in the last few months increased vandalism on Jewish cemeteries and synagogues throughout Europe and even in the United States. And one has to, after a while, step back and wonder, are these things connected?
Well, wrote a book on the history of Islam, and one thread that goes through it is an attitude of when your enemy is strong, retreat. When your enemy is weak, attack. And so when they would lose major battles, Battle of Malta, 1565, Battle of Lepanto, 1571, Battle of Vienna, 1680, whenever they lose, they would sort of go into remission for a generation or two. They would go back and they would become less aggressive. But then they would do some probing attacks. And when the non-Muslim world showed itself weak, they would whistle, and this would be sort of a motivation to say Allah has given us our infidels, and they would go from the remission stage to the outbreak stage. And so when you have the West, the non-Muslim world, showing itself weak to fundamentalist Muslims, this is a sign to be aggressive. And so I don't want to predict it, but with this icon of Notre Dame going up in flames, this is very encouraging to the fundamentalist Muslims to become more aggressive. And
I've learned through your American Minute that our founding fathers fought the Muslims. I mean, there was a lot of problems, and the Muslims are the ones that actually funneled all of the slaves from Africa over here. And right after Jefferson became president, they issued an ultimatum for him to give, what was it, $250,000 in in bribes, basically, or they'd declare war, and he declared war on them.
Yeah, the day after Jefferson's inauguration, he gets this demand, this extortion demand from the Pasha of Tripoli. And Jefferson said, I did the only reasonable thing. I sent in a squadron of ships, you know, the Navy and the Marines, and that's where we get the Marine anthem from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. But Muhammad robbed caravans. He got a whole chapter of the Quran on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's chapter 8, Surah 8. The title of the chapter is Spoils of War. One of the verses is, Allah has given you the slave girls as your booty. Well, then when they encroached on the Mediterranean, they would attack ships. And then they would raid the Christian coasts of Italy. In 846 AD, 11,000 Muslims invaded Rome, Italy. And they trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's, which later was tilted over. They had to take it down. They built the Vatican there. But they trashed the Basilica of St. Peter, and they trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. And so it was after that that Pope Leo decided to build a 39-foot wall around the Vatican. It's still there to this day, 846 AD. But they were carrying away and selling the Christians in slavery.
So the Pope wanted to build a wall to stop illegal immigrants? Is that what you're saying?
Hey, that's very good, Richard. Good connection there.
You know, and I do want to point out, after the Muslims conquered North Africa, which used to be Christian, there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. Today that's Tunisia. The Christians had embraced something called Pietism, this thought that if you really become a Christian, you should give away all your money and live in a cave. Or climb on a platform in the desert, bake in the sun, thinking you're denying your flesh and getting holier. You know, but it was all this me-focused salvation that sort of abandoned the spreading of the gospel and abandoned responsibility to society. So this pietism swept northern Africa. As a result, when Islam came through, it was unopposed. It was their version of separation of church and state, basically. And then it came into, and the Muslims crossed into Spain, the year 711. The Muslim leader was Tariq, and he landed at a mountain. The Arabic word for mountain is Jabal, and so they named it Jabal Tariq. We just call it Gibraltar. The Rock of Gibraltar, that was Jabal Tariq. That was the mount where he lands. And with 80,000 Muslims, they conquer Spain in 10 years. And then they conquer southern France, and they're stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. So the first century of Islam, they conquer from Arabia to Paris. And so we look at our first century and want to model ourselves after it. Well, there's this fundamental Muslim idea to model themselves after that first century. After a while, they toned down. The Christians, there was really no motivation to force the Christians to convert because they were the ones that paid the taxes. They were the dhimmi status. And so they had to ransom their lives once a year and so forth. And then the Turks convert to Islam, and they conquer Turkey. So all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. All the letters in the New Testament to Ephesus and Colossae and Galatia and Philippi and Corinth, all those cities were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. Now the Greeks were very prideful. They thought they were the true Christians because their land was where John spoke and Paul spoke, and they spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament. It was a very prideful and humbling thing for them to beg the Catholic West to come and help them. They viewed the Catholic West as the church split. They split in 1054 over 2 words in the Nicene Creed. The Greeks said the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father, and the Catholic West, the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. Now, as complicated as doctrinal issues are, the Muslims could care less. They sort of want to kill them all.
You know, we have something similar to what you're describing today. Yep. It's a different form, but we have Christians that are totally living just for themselves, thinking about only their relationship with God. They are not involved in our culture, and that's what you were saying gave place to the Muslims in the first place, was their disengagement.
You know, interesting. So Martin Luther, 1517, starts the Reformation. He had a very personal revelation that the just shall live by faith, very personal to him. Some princes want to break away from Rome, and they say, okay, kingdom of mine, you're all now Lutheran. And so the people say, okay, we're Lutheran. What do we believe? So to the people in those kingdoms, it was not a personal experience. And so a revival movement starts called Pietism again. Here it is. And it says being a Christian is more than just believing in doctrine. You have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life should change. And you won't go to worldly bars and worldly lewd theaters and get involved in worldly government. Wait, what was that last thing? Oh, the government's filled full of worldly people. If you're really Christian, you won't get involved. And that spread across Germany so much that there were kings that actually helped finance the Pietism movement to keep the Christians out of their hair. The Christians, that's what allowed Hitler to take power.
You know, this is amazing because if the devil can't stop you from serving the Lord, well, then he will try and push you so far into just that personal relationship that you disengage from your culture and give him freedom to do things. And that's what's happening in our culture.
There's a proverb that says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So if we're good people, we want to leave the same freedoms that we inherited to our kids, especially the freedom to preach the gospel.
I would say most people don't consider an inheritance being your form of government and those kind of things. They think about only money. You're applying it in a totally different way.
Yeah. So the inheritance to have the opportunity to choose what you're supposed to do with your life. That's our gift. You know, I talk in schools and kids struggle. I don't know what I'm going to do in my life. That struggle is a luxury that most people in the world don't have. If you're a Christian in Cairo, Egypt, you're garbage people. You have to spend your life digging through garbage. If you were born in India in the lowest caste as an untouchable, you'd have to clean the sewers. And if you're in North Korea and you're caught as you're put in a labor camp.
So Bill, going back to history again, and if you don't know history, it's like having Alzheimer's. Give us a perspective on, some people think that there is just a radical section of the Muslims, and this is something relatively new. I read a thing just this last week where somebody was attacking Omar, or whatever that congresswoman's name is, saying she is not representing Muslims, that it is a peaceful religion and all of this stuff. That doesn't square with history. Tell us what Muslims has been through history.
The definition of peace is different. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. The fundamental Islamic definition of peace is when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So world peace means world Islam.
World conquering.
So when they say it's a religion of peace, it's a religion of forcing and having the whole world submit to the will of Allah. The word Islam means submission, and a Muslim is one who has submitted. And so the half of the world that's submitted is called the Dar al-Islam, the house of submission. The half of the world that's in the process of submitting is called the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. The non-Muslim world is supposed to be war because it's in the process of submitting. Now, a moderate Muslim thinks the world is going to submit to Allah later. Maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world, maybe it's even figurative. And since it's so far off, they really don't think about it. They just want to live their lives, have their family, and they don't mind having you as a kafir infidel as a neighbor. That's fine. They're welcome here. They'll participate. The fundamental Muslim, they think the world's supposed to submit to Allah now, and they're really excited. They want to help make it happen. Then we're faced with this dilemma that the nicer and the weaker the non-Muslim world shows itself, it emboldens the fundamental ones. The moderate ones are caught in the middle. And the fundamental ones are just as happy to kill a moderate one as they are to kill an infidel. They say, well, you've departed from the way of Allah. And so the middle ground ones, they're like, as long as the non-Muslim world shows itself strong, they're like, okay, I'll side with you because I like raising my family and enjoying the freedoms. But when the non-Muslim world shows itself weak, they're like, it's like if a gang comes into your neighborhood and they're doing drug deals on your lawn and you call the police show up, arrest them. You'll call the police, you'll side with the police. But if the police don't show up, worse yet, if the gang comes to your door and says, we have somebody on the inside of the police department, they said you snitched on us, if you do it again, we'll kill you. Are you going to side with the police anymore? You're going to sort of keep, right? And so the Muslims are in the middle. They're sort of faced with, this decision. Or am I going to stick with underneath the umbrella of the non-Muslim world? Or am I going to have to, move in the opposite direction? So it's a...
Well, when Thomas Jefferson met with the Muslims, this is, I believe, before he was president. You can give us all of the details and make this right. But anyway, he met with them and he asked, why are you so angry with us? What have we done to provoke you? What did they say?
So Jefferson was the first ambassador from the U.S. to France. And he meets with the Muslim ambassador from Tripoli, who had captured a bunch of American ships. So they did the piracy, and they would take Europeans, and each country of Europe would pay an annual extortion tribute payment to the different Muslim kingdoms along North Africa. And when America was first started, we were underneath of the British extortion tribute payment. And so when we break away from America, Morocco says, you're not your own
From England.
Broke away from England.
Correct. There you go.
Right.
I
He's 5 miles down the road already.
my brain's still on Eastern time, so I'm on Mountain time. There's less oxygen
That's
up here.
it. That's what
it
it is. Yeah.
So when America breaks away from England, Morocco says, you're not covered by the English tribute payment. You need to pay up. And so they began to capture our American ships and stick our crews in the dungeons of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli. And that's when Jefferson goes over and meets with him and said, what did we do to offend you? We're like a brand new country. Why are you capturing our ships? And the Muslim ambassador said, it's just written in the Quran. All nations who are not submitted to Allah, it's our duty to take them captive and make them prisoners. And so Jefferson sends in the Marines. We show strength, right? And so when you show strength, they retreat. And then we have this period of peace. And
So let me ask you what you think about Trump. He's been showing strength in our foreign dealings and stuff like that. Do you think this is positive or negative when it comes to pushing back this?
I think it's very positive. And I think what some criticize as his unpredictability, I think that's a strength. Because the other side, they're like, we don't know what he's going to do, and is he going to fire some missiles or not? And that is, there's a phrase, crazy as a fox. In other words, he appears like he is not totally aware of everything, but he knows exactly what's going on, and he's really brilliant at it. And I almost think it's instinctive. It's like a second nature to him. The other side can spend millions of dollars hiring consultants to try to figure this out. He just sort of has a gut feeling. And he's a very strong leader. He reminds me a lot of my dad. I used to say my dad's sort of the last of the John Wayne generation. And that shows strength. Anyway.
But you know, Trump, some of the things that he's done, I believe, are stopping Islam, or at least making it hard for him, and it's got a ripple effect. Like, for instance, when he was over in France, he confronted some of these things, and I think it's having a worldwide effect if people would back him and give him the freedom to do it.
I think he's a reprieve from the one world government agenda.
Right.
And I think we need to take advantage of that and come up and get behind him and so forth. Because if we don't, what's going to happen next? I can't see another. Running for president is more or less a game of billionaires. I mean, the amount of money it takes to run, you either have to have the money or sell your soul to those that have the money to be able to back you. And then you're more or less a puppet of theirs. Phyllis Schlafly was a friend of mine, Eagle Forum. I knew her for 40 years. She endorsed Trump because she said he was not owned by the kingmakers. And what's that? Well, you have pictures of John McCain with George Soros and Hillary Clinton with George Soros. They're both hitting up the people that have the money. The rich person's position is, I'm just going to bet on every horse in the race, and whoever wins owes me. And so Trump wasn't owned, and a very courageous and unique individual.
Yeah. And you could give us this exact quote again. I'm setting you up. But it was something about when they were confronted, they said something about that when we are at I don't know the right way, but when we are at a disadvantage, we will make peace with you and do whatever until we get strong, and then we'll break our word. Tell us what that meant.
That was the Pasha of Tripoli. Yeah. And we forced him to sign a treaty, and he says, yeah, I'll sign it, but as soon as you leave the harbor, your treaty's waste paper. And he says, as soon as we regain our strength, we're going to attack you again.
And so it really all they know is force.
Isn't it wild how things haven't really changed at all? The Muslim philosophy, the way they do things, it hasn't changed. Our temptation to compromise, like the European nations paying tribute and all that, it's all the same.
Now there was around the year 800, after they had been chased out of Spain and they sort of reached an equilibrium, the Christians that they controlled were second-class dhimmi status, you began to see a moderation in Islam. It's called the Golden Age of Islam. And you had scientists like Al-Farabi and Avicenna and Averroes, and they would study Greek classics and Greek science and geometry and astronomy, and they would make these advancements. And they began to say, well, maybe paradise is not this sensual place filled full of virgins. Maybe it's more spiritual and everything. And if you were to take a snapshot of the world, you would have thought that the Muslims were about to experience a renaissance. But the whole thing gets slapped down by a Muslim leader named Al-Ghazali. And he's a mujahideen, a renewer of the faith. He's considered the second most important Muslim after Muhammad. And he said, stop studying Greek stuff. He even told them, don't study math and geometry, because if you study Greek math and geometry, you might study Greek philosophy and you get pulled away from Allah. So he said, stop, just study the Quran. It was a closing of the Muslim mind. Meanwhile, Western Europe got St. Thomas Aquinas, 1200s. He came up with the idea that truth is truth, even if a pagan stumbles across it, sort of eat the hay, spit out the stick. So you can read this Greek stuff, what's true you keep, what's not, throw it out. And this opened up the Western mind. And so the Western Europe started the first universities in Bologna and Oxford, and they would study. And so the Western world was ready for the Renaissance. And so when the Turks conquered the Byzantine Greek Empire, all the Greek scholars fled west with their Greek New Testaments under their arm and Greek art and architecture. This flood of Greek stuff into Western Europe we call the Renaissance, and the West was ready for it. And it birthed all the science and all the intellectual advancements, while meanwhile the Islamic world had a closing because of Al-Ghazali.
Well, we're going to take some questions here in just a few minutes, but here's a question from me. I know that the Crusades were a barbaric time. People were raped, plundered, all kinds of bad things happened. But I'd like your perspective on this, because I see it as Islam was basically about to conquer Europe, and that was a last-ditch effort to stop the advance of Islam. And even though I'm not saying it was done in the correct way, it was basically necessary to go and attack them, because, I mean, they were fighting for Western civilization.
Right. So I mentioned the Al-Ghazali. What he did is this renewer of the faith. He put Islam back into high gear. And he said, stop being friends. And so he destroys, there's a mad caliph in Jerusalem. He destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This was the church built over the tomb where supposedly Jesus rose from the dead. There's different tombs where they think. But this was the one that was built by St. Helena, Constantine's mom. He destroys it. And then a lot of the Syrian Christians that were living as second-class citizens, the stories already brought them to their altar and slit their throats. And so as the pilgrims were coming back from the Middle East, they're like telling the European kings, it's a mess over there. And so the Byzantine emperor, again, very prideful, he begs the West for help. And so the Pope is Pope Leo. Matter of fact, the Greeks, their most popular Greek saint is St. Nicholas. He lived during Roman times, gave to the poor, did it anonymously because he wanted the credit to go to God, sneak into poor neighborhoods, throw money in the window of poor people.
You just happened to have a book written about it.
Yeah.
I saw that in
Santa Claus real.
And so he was the most popular. St. Nicholas is to Greeks what St. Peter is to Catholics, what St. Patrick is to Irish. I mean, St. Nicholas is the most popular Greek saint. And anyway, when the Muslims were invading, they took his bones, shipped them over to Italy. So this was like taking our George Washington's bones from Mount Vernon and shipping them to some other country. I mean, this was a big deal. And so the Pope dedicates a church. It's still there to this day in a little town called Bari, B-A-R-I, and that's where Nicholas's bones are. But this same Pope, Urban II, goes to the Council of Clermont in 1095 A.D. and begs the European kings to send help to these Greek Christians that are getting killed. And that's called the First Crusade. And then they take back Jerusalem. Now, to be honest, the Byzantine emperor thought the West would come and say, here we are to help, where do you need us? The West says, you know what, we're going to take control of this whole thing. We're not going to just help you out. We're going for the Big Apple. We're going to get Jerusalem back. They did, but they didn't have all the land in between, so they didn't have the supply lines. And so after a century of controlling Jerusalem, that's when the Muslims organized and cut off the supply lines and drove them out. And so then the rest of the Crusades tried to take it back. Fourth Crusade was a mess. That's when the Doge of Venice decided to sack Constantinople rather than even attack the Muslims. St. Louis led the 7th and 8th Crusades. Richard the Lionheart, right, led the Third Crusade, left his brother King John in charge of England. I mean, this is all part of, but the Crusades basically bought Europe 2 centuries.
Yeah.
Europe didn't see itself as Europe. It saw itself as a lot of kingdoms. And as the Crusades, the attacks from Islam, caused the Europeans to see the bigger picture. It basically created the concept of Christendom or Europe. Sort of like the 13 colonies in America were very independent. They didn't get along. But then the war with England caused them to say, hey, there's a bigger picture. There's a United States. We can work together. And so the Crusades gave birth to the concept of Europe.
Man, that's awesome. I tell you what, I could sit and talk to you a long time. Let me just mention that he has a website. It's AmericanMinute.com. Is that correct? And he's got all of his books listed there. And also, if you go to Truth and Liberty, we have all of the American Minutes there, and they're organized according to topics. And that would be a real blessing. But we want to take some questions from our viewers and see what they have to say.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a lot of good ones here. Kyle on live chat asks, where does Bill see our future, especially pertaining to Christian and Muslim interaction?
If they sense weakness, they get emboldened and become more violent. When they sense strength, they sort of become less aggressive. I think that the Christians need to become more focused on evangelizing and sharing the gospel, because we want every Muslim to go to heaven. Mm-hmm. And we want them to experience the forgiveness. There's no concept in Islam of Allah loving you. Allah, a friend of mine does witnessing amongst Muslims, and he uses the Isaiah verse where it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to free the captives and give sight to the blind and to heal the brokenhearted. And he says, there's no verse in all of Islam where Allah wants to heal your broken heart. Allah doesn't care what your heart is. You have to submit, right? And so when the God of the Bible wants to heal their heart, it touches them in a way that they've never been touched before. So I think Christians need to realize that and reach out.
And our message of love is much stronger than the message of hate. We hear all of the negative things. We spent most of this broadcast talking about a lot of the negative things, but I know some people like Kamal Salim and others that are saying that, man, there are Muslims turning to the Lord by the hundreds of thousands. Matter of fact, I've got a place in Dubai and one in Pakistan that both of the imams have watched me on television, have been born again, and are teaching my stuff in their mosque every Friday. I don't even know how they get by with doing this, but we've got 2 imams that have been born again and are teaching all of their people the Christian doctrines and stuff. And so, anyway, good.
Well, it's interesting. So in the Quran, there's 2 sets of verses. The verses that Muhammad got when he was in Mecca, he was just a religious leader. Those are a little more peaceful. Verses he gets in Medina are more political, military, and they're more violent. Now, the Meccan verses, it even says that Mary was a virgin. That what Allah willeth, He willeth, and Mary conceived. So they believe in the virgin birth of Jesus.
Wow.
They even use the word, name Him Christ. And then they say that Allah sent down the Torah, the Psalms, and then the Injil, the Evangel, the Gospel. But they don't explain what the Injil is. Yeah. And so you can say, hey, it says right here, and that Allah sent down the Injil. Do you know what the Injil is? No, I don't. Well, this is the God. You've been free. Your sins have been paid for. The other, it's just.
Now, do you have this written in any of your books? How to use that?
It's the book called What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran. Right. There's another verse where it says, Jesus says, bless the day that I was born, bless the day that I died, and bless the day that I rose again. And so it acknowledges things about Jesus that are divine. In Muhammad, they say that he's the greatest prophet, but he never healed anybody. Muhammad won't be there on the day of judgment. They believe that Jesus will be there on the day of judgment. And anyway.
Well, it seems like so much of their beliefs, though, are completely inconsistent with everything that Jesus taught. How in the world could they incorporate that into their religion?
Well, 2 things. One, Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Muhammad traced his lineage through Ishmael. Ishmael was the son that was sent away. And so Islam has this view of Abraham's God that's a distant God. He's an unknowable God. You'll never know him. Even in the next life, you'll never meet him. Allah is forever unknowable. Jews and Christians get their view of Abraham's God through Isaac. Isaac was the son that stayed. Isaac was like, my dad's with me all the time. Everything my dad has is mine. We're like so close. So Christians and Jews have an intimate view of Abraham's God. The second is Cain and Abel. Cain wanted to worship God, but he did it through his works.
Yep.
And we know it's works because God told Adam, the ground is cursed for your sake. You'll bring forth fruit by the sweat of your brow. So Cain wanted to worship God. He's working really hard, but his works are rejected. Abel worshiped God through the lamb. The lamb paid for the sin. Now, if you do works, you can be prideful because you did more than the other guy. And when Cain's works were rejected, it says his countenance fell, his pride was hurt, he was offended, and he gets filled full of hatred and anger, wants to murder his brother that has the revelation of the Lamb.
So this is the same thing that's been going on since Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
It's, really, it's not Christianity versus Islam. It's just godliness versus ungodliness. It's evil. I've got a good friend, E.W. Jackson. I don't know if you know him.
He's a good friend, yeah.
But E.W. and I
He invited me to be out here at the event.
That's right.
Oh, yes.
On June, or what is that? July something.
18th, I think.
But anyway, he was sharing that, this whole racial thing, we make it black and white. It's just godly versus ungodly is what it is. And you can talk about it in terms of Muslim versus Christianity, black versus white, rich, poor. It's just the devil is all it is. It's sin. It's not racial. It's not religious. It's just sin.
But at the politically speaking, the liberals, they want to pretend like there's no problem. They want to say all religions are the same. There's no truth. How dare you think that Islam is anything but equal to any other religion? And I think
it plays right into their hands.
It does play into their hands. Don't you agree?
Well, there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam is not just a religion,
right?
Because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a religious leader and a political leader and a military leader. Yep. So sort of RPM, religious, political, military. And so the religion is all three. Our effort to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? He was all three. And Jesus was not a military leader. Jesus, the apostles never led armies, and so it's. But it's important for us to explain that God is a just God. He has to judge every sin, and Jesus was the Lamb that took the judgment for the sin. So God is just. He has to judge every sin, but He's loving that He provided the Lamb to take the judgment. If you don't believe in the Lamb, He's a just God. He has to judge every one of your sins. If He doesn't judge him, He's giving consent to him. Silence equals consent. You know the old wedding ceremonies? The minister will say, anybody against this wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace. If you're holding your peace, you're giving consent. If God holds His peace and doesn't judge the sin, He's giving consent to the sin. He's not going to give consent. He has to judge. And so you either go under Jesus and He takes the judgment for you, or He has to judge you. Otherwise, so the message to Muslims is God loves you so much that He provided a lamb to take the judgment for every one of your sins.
And even though you may not be against the Muslim as an individual, you certainly can't support Sharia law. It goes against everything that this nation stands for. Mormonism, they believed in polygamy and stuff, and yet the United States took a stand against that and said that, no, you can't be practicing all this. And so we need to do that.
Absolutely. We've got a lot more questions.
All right.
You want to get
we
a couple
need to
more
take
in?
some more questions.
Here, several folks are asking questions about socialism and things of that nature. Evidently tonight, Bernie Sanders had a town hall meeting on Fox News, and he's saying that health care for everybody can be paid for by taxes that are less than what they're paying for in premiums now. And then the question is, what about those who pay no taxes?
Right. So it's the concept of you create a problem and then you have an answer that's worse than the problem. So if the government wasn't involved at all, it'd be like your car insurance, right? You get to pick which car insurance is. There's one commercial that says this particular company will let you pick which coverage that you want, right? So that would be the way healthcare would be. Everybody could pick what they wanted. The idea is that they make these burdens so bad that it collapses, primarily through lawsuits. If they would put a cap on the lawsuits, the insurance premiums wouldn't have to be as high and so forth. But they create the problem, and then they come around and say, well, let the government take over. The problem is, what the government giveth, the government can taketh away. Right. The government, Hitler, 1933, became Chancellor of Germany, and they had government health care. And then their economy cratered. And then they said, we have to cut expenses. like keeping alive useless, retarded people. I mean, they don't even know who they are. They're not going to miss being alive. Then they got rid of the elderly. They had their life already, and it's a low quality of life. Look, nobody even visits them. Nobody's going to miss them, and let's just let them go on. A nice peaceful death. And then they got rid of the prisoners. I mean, this person is a leech, and why are we having to pay money to feed them in prison? So they got rid of them. Then they got rid of the political ones who were speaking out against the state. They're sort of holding us back from this new utopia. Finally, they decided that they wanted to cleanse the gene pool of inferior races, and they killed the Jews. But it all started with nationalized health care.
And did you know that I know people personally who were employees of mine in my England office, who one of them needed a gallbladder surgery, and because it wasn't critical, they pushed them down the road for 2 years. They couldn't get gallbladder surgery, and finally they went and had to pay for it on their own because the national health care wouldn't do it. And then I know another person that because their quality of life, they were older, they just basically said, we don't want to spend our money on you because your life, you don't have that many years left. And it's exactly what you're talking about. And it didn't just happen with Hitler, it's happening now. And that healthcare system, you cannot pay for everyone's healthcare. It just doesn't work.
There was one country in Europe where a family took their son, it was a 12-year-old, and he may have been handicapped or something, and the doctor came out of the room and said, I took care of it. And what'd they do? He euthanized him. And he's like, well, the government's paying for the health care, and he, got a low quality. The parents were crushed, but what can you do?
And some of the leaders in Canada send their kids, their family members here to get surgery because they know that it's better in the United States than it is in Canada where it would have been paid for. I tell you, it doesn't work. Socialism is a failure. It's always been a failure. I heard a guy on Laura Ingraham's program. Have you been with her? It seems like you've been with everybody else.
I've met her, but not on her program.
But anyway, I heard a guy on her program who was promoting socialism, and she says, give me one example of where it's worked. And he said, and he got off the subject, and she brought him back. Give me one example. And 3 times she asked him this, and finally he says, well, it's never worked, but it's because the capitalists stop us from doing what we want.
Yeah, we just need more power.
That's it. But he had to admit there is not one single example of socialism.
And the little dangled carrot that holds out is all the people that tried in the past didn't do it right. We're going to do it the right way this time. Unfortunately, anybody that doesn't fit in with that ends up becoming a hindrance, and they end up wanting to get rid of them, and that's where you end up to the horrors of the millions that die.
Yeah. Let's try and get another couple of questions in.
Well, let's see here. A couple people are asking, we're talking about all these important things, and they want to know what can we do about it. Here's one that says, how can you convince the church to get out and build hospitals and schools? And why can't the church work with the local mayor and develop a plan to build schools and hospitals? How do we change this mindset in the church today, where it seems like all we care about is just, what's good for us and meeting in our little circles instead of actually going out and changing society? Right.
So 8 of the 10 largest hospital corporations in America are church-related.
Let me just say this, and you will explain it better, but I think that's a wrong perception. The church has done a lot in this healthcare stuff and all of this. So you give them all of the details, but I think the perception is wrong to say that we aren't doing anything about it.
Yeah, so the church invented hospitals. 325 AD, a Council of Nicaea, they say that every church that has a cathedral should have an infirmary. And why? Because people would go on pilgrimages and show up sick. And so the word for traveler is hosp. And so that where you get the word hospital or hospitality or hotel or hostel. And so then in the 600s, you had the Order of Nuns, the Sisters of Charity, and they started hospitals to take care of the poor. Again, it was mostly convalescent, bedpans and so forth. The bubonic plague, 75 million people die in Europe. Nobody wanted to bury the dead bodies. The Election Brothers, some Catholic men start an order, and they give Christian burials, and then somebody doesn't die right away. They just sort of do hospice, and every now and then somebody recovers, and so then they end up starting the hospitals. And so they would start this all across Europe. The French Revolution comes along, and they chop off all these nuns' heads, but they keep the order going nonetheless. And then Ben Franklin helped start the first hospital in America. Before that, you had doctors going around with their bags to the different homes. And on the dedication of the hospital, it says to the work of Christ and so forth there in Pennsylvania. But in America, it was the different churches that started it. And it was the Catholic nuns that started the first hospital west of the Mississippi, and the Sisters of St. Joseph. And then you had nuns following the armies around in Europe. Why? Because people get killed. They didn't have the logistics and ambulances and stuff. So the whole order of nuns, Florence Nightingale said there's no one trained as well as a Catholic nun as far as nurses. So the nun's hat turned into the nurse's cap. The little cap that the nurses wear. And
again, lack of knowing history is like Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And so that you have the Seventh-day Adventists started hospitals, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, all these different denominations, they started the hospitals, and they would have chapels in there and so forth. But the government comes in and says, wants to take it over. And now we sort of forget the Christian heritage that they had.
Yeah, absolutely.
Last question.
Got one more. Okay. Cowboy on live chat says, could you please give us a historical perspective on the use of psychological manipulation by Marxism as it takes control of a nation?
One is called psychological projection. Sigmund Freud coined the term. It's where rude people call everybody else rude.
Yeah.
Hateful people call everybody else hateful. They even put up websites where they list everybody that they hate. And so this got into politics. Karl Marx says, accuse others of what you're guilty of. Mm-hmm. And David Axelrod, the former president's campaign manager, said, in Chicago politics, we have a tradition where you throw a brick through your own campaign office window, and then you call a press conference to accuse your opponent.
That kind of reminds you of Jesse Smollett, or however you say his name. Smollett.
And so this is, you accuse your opponent of what you're guilty of.
Racism.
The opponent has to come clean and show that they didn't do it, and it's headlines. Their name gets associated with this accusation. Finally, when he points back at you and says, you're the one doing it, by that time the water's muddied, the public doesn't know who's telling the truth, and you get a pass. So it works. So if you're colluding with the Russians, maybe getting $145 million donations to your foundation in exchange for a fifth of the U.S. uranium, and you have a bunch of people in your government department that are participating in this, what do? You accuse your opponent of colluding with the Russians, and all those people that you had collude, they're now in charge of the investigation. Meanwhile, they're destroying all the evidence against them while they're investigating you.
Bill, I hate to stop you, but we are on CTN. The network has been gracious enough to broadcast us, and we do need to stop at an exact time. Real quickly, give how they can contact you, because I'm sure...
AmericanMinute.com.
Well, that was real quick. But man, we appreciate you being with us. And also, you can go to Truth and Liberty, and we have all of his American Minutes listed there topically. And you can also go to AmericanMinute.com and sign up and have them sent to you. That's the way that I get them every day. But again, we appreciate you being with us. Hopefully, you will go check out Bill Federer. I tell you what, this man is like a walking encyclopedia, and he would be a real blessing to you. So thank you for being with us. Remember, we do this every Monday night, our Truth and Liberty broadcast, and I think, is it next week or the week after, we're going to have Abby Johnson on
next week.
The one that they just made the movie Unplanned about. She will be our guest.
Powerful.
You will be blessed. So join us next Monday night and every Monday night for the Truth and Liberty broadcast. Thank you for being with us. God bless you, and we'll see you again next week for Truth and Liberty.
Join us next time for the Truth and Liberty broadcast. Find tonight's episode and related articles and links at truthandliberty.net.